Lesson 45, Redefining Equality, from Black Power to Affirmative Action. Redefining equality, from Black Power to affirmative action. How did the civil rights activists change their strategies and goals in the 1960s and 1970s, and how successful were they in achieving racial equality? Introduction. James Meredith, the first African-American graduate of the University of Mississippi, began a campaign he called the March Against Fear in 1966. He planned to walk from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, and encouraged African-Americans he met along the way to assert their right by registering to vote. Meredith was shot by a sniper only 30 miles out of Memphis. Although he ultimately survived the attack, he was hospitalized. A number of civil rights leaders stepped up to complete Meredith's march following his hospitalization. Among them were Dr. Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael. The young leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, on their first day of the march, an angry policeman knocked King down. Carmichael prepared to retaliate, only to be stopped by other marchers and scolded by King for straying from their nonviolent strategy. To Carmichael, the incident was unassociated with nonviolence. The incident was unassociated with nonviolence, insisting it was about self-defense. For days after, the marchers endured insults and threats from angry whites. When they reached Greenwood, Mississippi, Carmichael was arrested while trying to set up a tent for the night. By the time I got out of jail, he recalled, I was in no mood for compromise. With racist arrogance. The night of his release, Carmichael addressed a rally in Greenwood, declaring, "It's time we stand up and take over. We've been saying freedom for 6 years, and we ain't got nothing. What are we going to start saying now is Black Power." He asked the crowd repeatedly, "What do we want?" Each time the crowd roared back, "Black Power." Carmichael's speech and the crowd's response reflected a turning point in the civil rights movement. For over 10 years, the movement's leaders had favored a strategy of nonviolence, with integration as their primary goal. In referring to Black Power, Carmichael signaled a change in what many blacks wanted and how they wanted to achieve their goals. Stokely Carmichael first spoke of Black Power in 1966. Martin Luther King Jr. had some reservations. "I don't believe in black separatism," he said, "but certainly if Black Power means the amassing of political and economic power in order to gain our just and legitimate goals, then we all believe in that." The nation's black ghettos explode. In 1963, American writer James Baldwin published an essay on being black in the United States. Baldwin reminded readers that blacks had waited far too long for equality and warned that if the United States did not live up to its ideals soon, it could cause an eruption of violence. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites, and the relatively conscious blacks, do not falter in our duty, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare. If we do not now dare, everything the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. No more water, the fire next time. Indeed, fire did erupt when anger over slow progress and the federal government's weak support for civil rights boiled over. Beginning in 1964, African Americans sparked violent protests in cities nationwide. From Watts to Newark, riots in the streets. Almost 70% of African Americans lived in large cities in the 1960s. Urban blacks were often concentrated in ethnic ghettos, or parts of a city where people belonging to a single ethnic group live. People sometimes live in ethnic ghettos to be among people who share their culture, but oftentimes they live in these neighborhoods because social and economic conditions prevent them from moving elsewhere. This was true for African Americans due to job discrimination. Many could not afford to live anywhere else. Even those with good jobs found it nearly impossible to purchase a home in white neighborhoods. In August of 1965, a race riot exploded in Watts, an African American ghetto in Los Angeles. The immediate cause of this riot was a surge in police brutality, while the more long-term causes stemmed from African Americans' festering frustrations about poverty, prejudice, and police mistreatment. The Watts riot lasted for 6 days. During that time, 34 people died, almost 900 were injured, and nearly 4,000 were arrested. Rioters burned and looted whole neighborhoods, resulting in $45 million in property damage. The rioting only ended when 14,000 members of the National Guard were sent to Watts to restore order. Over the next few years, riots erupted in other cities. In 1967 alone, more than 100 cities experienced violent protests. During a riot in Detroit, Michigan, 43 people died and over 1,000 were wounded. Eventually, the army suppressed the riot by sending in tanks and soldiers with machine guns. Similarly, riots in Newark, New Jersey lasted 6 days and resulted in many deaths and injuries. The Kerner Commission report, Moving Toward Two Societies. In response to continued rioting in the summer of 1967, President Lyndon Johnson, or LBJ, established the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders to examine the cause of the riots. This commission, which became known as the Kerner Commission after its leader, Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois, issued a final report in 1968 that concluded, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." After further investigation, the commission found that riots were often provoked by a specific event stemming from a reservoir of underlying grievances. Social and economic conditions in the riot cities constituted a clear pattern of severe disadvantage for Negroes compared with whites. Negroes had completed fewer years of education, had fewer had attended high school. Negroes were twice as likely to be unemployed and were more than twice as likely to be living in poverty. Although housing cost Negroes relatively more, they had worse housing and 3 times as likely to be overcrowded and substandard. National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, 1968. The report cited the civil rights movement's unfulfilled expectations as a cause of rioting. It stated that when civil rights expectations were not addressed, some African Americans turned to violence as a way to move the system. The commission called on the country to address the inequalities that riots exposed, urging, "It is time now to turn with all the purpose in our command to the major unfinished business of the nation. It is time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, white and black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group." The rise of black power and black pride. Martin Luther King Jr. visited Los Angeles, Section 2. Martin Luther King Jr. visited Los Angeles after the Watts riot to investigate what had happened and why, but King was booed by Watts residents who had lost faith in his strategy and goals. Nonviolent resistance eroded barriers to integration in the South, but these victories had taken 10 years and many urban blacks were impatient for change. Plus, they were now unsure whether they wanted to integrate into white society that they deemed very racist and corrupt. As activism spread beyond the South, the civil rights movement was changing. Malcolm X advocates for black nationalism. One of the foremost leaders in driving the civil rights change was a former convict named Malcolm X. Born in 1925 as Malcolm Little, Malcolm X strayed into life of crime during his teenage years and was eventually arrested and jailed. In prison, he was introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of a religious group known as the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslims. Muhammad asserted that blacks were Earth's first people, but they had been tricked out of power and long oppressed by evil whites. Of Muhammad's appeal to African-American convicts, Malcolm X later wrote, "Here is a black man, caged behind bars, probably for years, put there by the white man. You let this caged-up black man start thinking the same way I did when I first heard Elijah Muhammad's teachings. Let him start thinking how with better breaks, when he was young and ambitions, he might have been a lawyer, a doctor, a scientist, anything. That's why black prisoners become Muslims so fast when Elijah Muhammad's teachings filter into their cages. The white man is the devil. It is a perfect echo of the black convict's lifelong experience." After discharge from prison in 1952, Malcolm Little joined the Nation of Islam. He also changed his name to Malcolm X, stating that Little was the name of the white slave owner. He chose X because a Negro in America can never know his true family name or even what tribe he was descended from. He quickly became the Nation of Islam's most effective preacher. In 1959, he was featured in a week-long television special called The Hate That Hate Produced, which garnered widespread attention for Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. As a black Muslim, Malcolm rejected the goals of the early civil rights movement. Rather than seek integration, the Nation of Islam promoted a black nationalism, a doctrine that called for complete separation from white society. Black Muslims worked to become independent from whites by establishing their own businesses, schools, and communities. Malcolm X also rejected nonviolence as a strategy to enact change. Speaking to a group of black teenagers in New York City in 1964, he said, "If the leaders of the nonviolent movement can go to the white community, the teaching and teach nonviolence, good. I'd go along with that. But as long as I see them teaching nonviolence only in the black community, we can't go along with that. If black people alone are going to be the ones who are nonviolent, that's not fair. We throw ourselves off guard. In fact, we disarm ourselves and make ourselves defenseless. By the time of this speech, Malcolm X had split with the Nation of Islam. During a pilgrimage to the Muslim holy city of Mecca in 1964, he met Muslims of all races, including blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I could call my brothers. Upon his return home, Malcolm X converted to Orthodox Islam and reached out to peoples of all races, making broader calls for human rights. This shift upset many black Muslims, and in 1965, 3 members of the Nation of Islam assassinated Malcolm X while he was speaking in New York City. SNCC stands up for Black Power. A year after Malcolm X's death, SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael introduced Black Power to the civil rights movement. Black Power had a variety of meanings, including political power, economic power, and pride in being black. In a speech discussing Black Power, Carmichael observed that this country knows what power is. It knows it very well, and it knows what Black Power is cause it deprived black people of for 400 years. So it knows what Black Power is. We are on the move for our liberation. The question is, will white people overcome their racism and allow for that to happen in this country? If that does not happen, brothers and sisters, we have no choice but to say very clearly, move over or we're going to move on over you. Stokely Carmichael speech, Berkeley, California, 1966. Carmichael later converted SNCC from an integrated organization to an all-black organization. We cannot have white people working in the black community, he argued. Black people must be seen in positions of power, doing and articulating, speaking for themselves. Black Panthers worked for self-determination. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were 2 of the many African Americans Malcolm X had influenced. In 1966, they founded the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, so named in order to send the world a message. An early supporter explained the Black Panther was a vicious animal who, if he was attacked, would not back up. It was a political symbol that we were here to stay and we were here to do whatever needed to be done to survive. The Black Panther Party developed a 10-point platform outlining its goals. The first and last points focused on self-determination. We want freedom, the platform began. We want power to determine our destiny of our black community. Other demands included jobs, decent housing, education, and teaches our true history. An immediate end to police brutality. The platform also called for the United Nations to supervise a plebiscite, or a vote on a question of importance among African Americans to determine the will of black people as to their national destiny. While the Black Panthers provided services for blacks in their community, including establishing medical clinics and free children's breakfast programs, they were best known for their efforts to end police mistreatment of blacks. To monitor street interactions between police and black citizens, they sent observers carrying law books to provide information about people's rights, tape recorders to document what was said, and shotguns to demonstrate that they were prepared to defend themselves. Because Black Panthers carried weapons, they were willing to challenge police. Law enforcement agencies viewed them as dangerous radicals. Local police and FBI agents often raided Panthers' offices, homes, and when police confrontations turned violent, the Panthers involved were arrested and jailed. With its legal troubles mounting, the Black Panther Party dissolved by the mid-1970s. Black Power at the polls brings political gains. Many African Americans believed that the concept of black power translated to black political influence. Supported by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, civil rights groups organized voter registration campaigns across the South, raising the number of Southern blacks registered to vote from 1 million in 1964 to 3.1 million in 1968. Across the United States, African American candidates successfully campaigned for both black and white votes. Edward Brooke of Massachusetts was elected to the Senate in 1966, becoming the first black senator since 1881. And 2 years later, Shirley Chisholm of New York became the first black woman to be elected to the House of Representatives. In 1969, African-American House of Representative members founded the Congressional Black Caucus, which has worked over the years to address legislative concerns of African-American citizens. Black politicians also proved victorious in state and local elections. In 1967, Carl Stokes of Cleveland, Ohio, became the first black mayor of a major U.S. city, and 6 years later, Tom Bradley became the first black mayor of Los Angeles. Bradley won by forging a powerful coalition that included inner-city blacks and the Jewish community and business labor leaders. He built bridges to whites and other groups, noted political scientists, without ever losing his commitment to the black community. Bradley was reelected 4 times, serving as mayor for 20 years. African Americans also rose to prominence in the judicial branch of government. Thurgood Marshall, who had argued Brown v. Board of Education as the NAACP's lead attorney, was appointed the first black Supreme Court justice in 1967. Black pride, the growth of Afrocentrism. For many African Americans, black power included taking pride in their African heritage. This emphasis on African history, African culture, and the achievements of African peoples and their descendants in the United States came to be known as Afrocentrism. Afrocentric scholars argued that most schools' history curriculums ignored the many contributions of African peoples. In their view, Afrocentrism helped to balance the Eurocentric or European-centered view of the past, long taught to both black and white American schoolchildren. African Americans displayed pride in their heritage in numerous ways. College students advocated for African and African American studies classes, while museums began to exhibit African American history and art. Many blacks also dressed in traditional African clothing, wore hair in African styles called afros, and exchanged their Eurocentric names for Afrocentric ones. In 1966, a black scholar invented an Afrocentric holiday called Kwanzaa, which occurs each year between December 26th and January 1st. During Kwanzaa, black Americans celebrate 7 principles of African American culture, including faith, creativity, and unity. Black writers expanded Afrocentric culture by writing about their experience. Poets like Nikki Giovanni and playwrights like Amiri Baraka and August Wilson embedded the struggles of African Americans into their poems and plays. Novelists like Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker wrote popular novels about both past and present African American culture. Roots, a 12-hour television miniseries on African American life, became one of the most highly rated shows on television history upon its release in 1977. Based on a historical novel by Alex Haley, Roots followed several generations of enslaved black families. More than 250 colleges planned courses around broadcasts, and over 30 cities declared official Roots weeks. Former presidents of the Urban League, Vernon Jordan, called the miniseries the single most spectacular educational experience in race relations in America. The federal government, Section 3, the federal government confronts racism. On March 31st, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. preached at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. In his sermon, King spoke frankly about racism. It is an unhappy truth that racism is a way of life for the vast majority of white Americans. Spoken and unspoken, acknowledged and denied, subtle and sometimes not so subtle. Something positive must be done. Everyone must share in the guilt as individuals and institutions. The hour has come for everybody, for all institutions of the public sector and the private sector, to work to get rid of racism. That hour never came. Martin Luther King remaining awake through the Great Revolution, 1968. That hour never came for King. 4 days later, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while attempting to support a sanitation workers' strike. Ensuing riots erupted in over 100 cities, including Washington, D.C. As dawn broke on April 6, 1968, a thick pall of smoke hung over the nation's capital. In the wake of this tragedy, the federal government increased its efforts to end racism and discrimination in American society. Banning racial discrimination in housing. Before his death, King shifted focus from integration to economic equality. As part of this campaign, he took on racial discrimination in housing. African Americans faced challenges to rent to blacks. When they found homes to purchase, banks were reluctant to give loans to black applicants. Under King's leadership, the black community united with realtors and bankers to encourage open housing in Chicago, but very little actually happened. Days after King's assassination in 1968, Congress utilized King's efforts and the current national grief to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law stipulated a fair housing clause that banned discrimination in housing sales and rentals and gave the federal government the authority to file lawsuits against the fair housing offenders. Desegregating public schools. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional, ordering schools a year later to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Despite this order, a decade later, only 1.2% of black school children in the South attended integrated schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 enabled the federal government to enforce school desegregation. Government officials pressured school districts to integrate by threatening to withhold federal funds if they failed to comply. By 1968, the percentage of African American students in the South attending integrated schools had risen to 32%. However, the Supreme Court was beginning to lose patience with school districts that were slow to integrate. In 1969, case Alexander v. Holmes, County Board of Education, involving a segregated Mississippi school district attempting to delay integration, the court reconsidered with all deliberate speed. In the court's decision, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "There are many places still in this country where schools are either white or Negro, and not just schools for all children as the Constitution requires. In my opinion, there is no reason why such a wholesale deprivation of the constitutional rights should be tolerated another minute. I fear that this long denial of constitutional rights is due in large part to the phrase 'with all deliberate speed.' I would do away with that phrase completely." Alexander v. Holmes, County Board of Education, 1969. 3 years later, the Supreme Court debated school segregation. In Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, this case raised the question of whether de facto segregation caused by housing patterns was constitutional. In North Carolina's Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District, most children lived in predominantly white or black school neighborhoods and attended all white or all black schools. In 1970, a federal judge ordered the district to integrate its schools through busing, establishing a desegregated plan by which some students, including very young ones, would be bused to schools outside their neighborhoods to create racial balance. The school districts appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing that the judge overstepped. In 1971, the court delivered a unanimous decision that upheld the judge's busing plan. We find no basis for housing or no basis for holding this local school authorities may not be required to employ bus transportation as one tool of school desegregation, wrote Chief Justice Warren Burger. Desegregation plans cannot be limited to walk-in schools. Using busing to achieve racial balance in schools. The court's approval of busing to integrate schools generated controversy. Supporters argued that black children received higher test scores when attending integrated schools, but many parents, black and white, strongly believed their children should attend schools close to home. They worried about the effects of long bus rides, especially young children, and feared the safety of children bused into unfamiliar neighborhoods. Nowhere was resistance to busing stronger than in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. In 1974, a judge ordered the busing of 17,000 Boston children to desegregate the city's schools, in order that many white families opposed. Resistance was particularly strong in South Boston, a mostly white neighborhood. When school began at South Boston High School that fall, 90% of its white students boycotted classes, while black students walking from class to boarding buses home were pelted with rocks. A white student was stabbed in racial confrontation at the school later that year, inciting an angry white mob that trapped 135 black students in the school building for 4 hours. A force of 500 police officers was sent to South Boston High, which had only 400 students to maintain order. Over the next 2 years, an estimated 20,000 white students left Boston's public schools entirely to avoid busing. Some attended private schools, while others moved with their families to the suburbs. As a result, blacks and Hispanics comprised the majority of Boston's public schools population by 1976. Despite public resistance, courts continued to enforce the Brown decision. By 1976, almost half of black students in the South attended schools with a majority of white students. In comparison, only 27.5% of black students in the Northeast integrated schools. Fighting racism in the workplace through affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed hiring discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or national origin. But many argued that simply leveling the playing field was inadequate. As President Lyndon Johnson observed in a speech to graduates of Howard University, "You do not take a person who for 4 years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of the race and say, 'You're free to compete with all the others,' and still just justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. Lyndon Johnson, Howard University, 1965. Johnson argued for stronger legislation to counteract discrimination that had long denied equal opportunities to minorities. One policy by which to achieve this was known as affirmative action, which called on employers to actively seek to increase the number of minorities in the workforce. Affirmative action was first introduced by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 when he issued an executive order requiring that contractors working with the federal government take affirmative action to hire minorities. President Johnson expanded upon Kennedy's policy by including women, and he also required contractors to possess written affirmative action plans. This is the next and most profound stage of the battle for civil rights, Johnson said. We seek not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. President Richard Nixon significantly furthered affirmative action policy. In an executive order, he required government contractors to develop an acceptable affirmative action program that included goals and timetables. Equalizing opportunities through preferential treatment. Although many Americans agreed with affirmative action goals, its implemented practices have been notably controversial. An affirmative action plan may set specific goals such as the number of minority women workers to be hired and may include a timetable with dates for achieving those goals. Yet many also give preferential treatment for some groups or give preference to a minority or female job applicant because that person's ethnicity or gender. Many believed preferential treatment was unfairly discriminatory against white males. During the 1960s, many colleges and universities adopted affirmative action plans to attract more minority students. Members of minority groups were often given preferential treatment over white students who were equally or more qualified. Such treatment was necessary, admission officers argued, to increase opportunities for minorities and to create a diverse student body. In the late 1970s, a white male named Alan Bakke challenged preferential treatment in university admissions. Bakke had twice applied for admissions to the University of California Davis School of Medicine and was rejected both times. In contrast, minority candidates with lower grade point averages and test scores were being admitted under a special admissions program. Bakke concluded that he had been refused admission because he was white, and he sued the school for reverse discrimination. In 1977, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke reached the Supreme Court. After hearing arguments from both sides, the court was deeply divided. 4 justices were firmly against any consideration of race in university admissions, while another 4 felt just as strongly that race should be considered. The remaining Justice, Lewis Powell, believed race should be used as a criterion in choosing students, but opposed the University of California's preferential treatment system. Writing for the majority, Powell cautioned racial and ethnic classifications of any sort are inherently suspect and call for the most exacting judicial scrutiny. The court's ruling narrowly upheld affirmative action by declaring that race could be used as a criterion in admission decisions. However, the ruling also stated that racial quotas were unconstitutional and that race could not be used as the sole criterion. The court ordered the university to admit Bakke to the medical school, but its ruling did not end the debate over affirmative action and preferential treatment for women and minorities. In 1976, distribution of college-enrolled students. 1976, 82% white, and by 2014, 55% white. So there's that. The civil rights movement changed the course of the mid-1960s, moving beyond the South and expanding its goals. Impatient for change, some activists also abandoned the strategy of nonviolence. Black Power. Watts riots, Kerner Commission, Nation of Islam, Black Panther Party, Civil Rights Act of 1968, Swan versus Charlotte, Mecklenburg Board of Education, and Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, Civil Rights Act 1968. This law's key clause bans discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex.